Justice is supposed to be blind and thus fair, but a recent report from Legal Aid Ontario highlights where this province falls short and what to do about it, particularly as it relates to racialized communities. With us now to explore these issues in Whitby, Ontario, Krista Big Canoe, Legal Director, Aboriginal Legal Services. In the West End of Toronto, in Bluredale, Nani Yanful, Staff Lawyer and Legal Team Lead at the Black Legal Action Centre. And in the annex of Toronto, Anna Maria Enanager, criminal defense lawyer and a partner at Ruby, Schiller, Enanager and Di Giuseppe Barristers. And it's good to have you three with us here on TVO tonight for an important discussion. And Anna Maria, I will put you to work first. The big issues faced by racial minorities in Ontario's criminal justice system today. Go ahead, start to lay out the story for us if you would.
Well, what we've seen over the course of a number of years is an increase not only in the representation of racial minorities in our criminal justice system, but also in our federal institutions, so for incarceration. And the reason for this stems from anywhere from over-policing of certain neighborhoods to the increase in likelihood that one would be denied bail if one is a racialized individual, and also the increase or a large number of sentences that are passed down, a higher number of custodial sentences that are passed down for individuals who are racialized. And a lot of this has to do with sort of the nexus between the racialization as a factor that contributes or that is in tandem with impoverishment in the province of Ontario.
Krista, how do you see the issue?
Well, I mean, it's been a long-standing issue for Indigenous people in terms of over-incarceration within the criminal justice system. I mean, numbers from 2016, and that's kind of the census or stats we have to rely on just because the regularity is not the same. But over 25% of total federal incarcerated population is Indigenous. And for women, it's 35% of federally sentenced women are Indigenous. We often see Indigenous youth highly overrepresented in the criminal justice system and in justice in general. Like when we're talking about court systems or the types of things legal aid needs to do, it also goes beyond criminal. It's things like child welfare and child apprehension, and the numbers are still too high. And this is something we've known now for decades.
Nana, let's focus on one of those things, namely the overrepresentation, for example, of Black Canadians in our prison systems. To what do you attribute that?
Yes, Steve. So I think that a lot of it has to do with anti-Black racism, actually, in the criminal justice system. So that can be all the way from, as Anna Maria said earlier, racial profiling by police, the over-surveillance. But I think it's also in terms of how discretion is used, right? Crown prosecutorial discretion, how defense lawyers, other lawyers treat clients, how many arguments are made when it comes to race-based arguments that can be challenged in terms of charter litigation, the sentencing. But I think also when we look at the different systems, as Krista mentioned, that funnel folks into the criminal justice system, I don't think we can ignore the overrepresentation in the child welfare system. For Black folks specifically, in Toronto, we're about 8.5% of the population, yet over 40% of our children are in care. That's ridiculous. And it's also connected to the disparate treatment that Black youth from JK all the way to post-secondary are experiencing in the education system.
Nana, let me do a follow-up with you, because I know there will be lots of people watching this right now who think we live in the province of Ontario in the year 2020, and they just do not believe that there is something called institutional racism. Maybe unconscious, maybe subconscious bias, but there are going to be people watching this who do not believe that Crown attorneys or police officers make it a point of their daily work to go out and be purposefully racist against people. Would you care to comment on that?
Yes, I think, as you mentioned, conscious and unconscious bias is really key, right? I don't think it's always conscious. I don't think it necessarily has to be conscious. How anti-Black racism operates is quite insidious, and it hasn't just started in 2020, as Krista mentioned, right? This has been decades, it's been centuries, and we can't talk about this without talking about the legacy for Black folks in this country and in this province. The legacy of colonialism, slavery, segregation, it manifests today in different forms. So when a police officer or a bylaw officer ignores, some communities who are not socially distancing, yet in other communities is ticketing at high rates, those things might not be conscious, but it's based on that legacy of who is more feared to be feared, who poses more of a danger to the public, who doesn't have the supports and access to be able to push back against that. So I think it's broader. It's not always conscious, but it does exist, and we're seeing that in the numbers that we talked about earlier.
Well, Anna Maria, can you follow up on that? Do we have empirically provable data that show right now, and let's just take the example that we just heard from Nana, that bylaw officers are out there ticketing people, for example, for not following COVID-19 protocols, not appropriately physically distancing? Do we know for a fact that people of color, for example, are being disproportionately handed those citations?
Well, in that specific case, those specific citations, the data is unclear only because it's difficult to collect so soon after the event, so soon after the regulations come into play, and so soon after people have started reporting that they've been ticketed. There are a number of organizations that are collecting that data, but again, a lot of that is dependent on whether people have access to the internet and whether they have access to the websites of organizations that are collecting data on who's being more ticketed and targeted. And so we don't have a clear picture on that. But what we do have is a lot of data from decades of research in this area where we know that there's overrepresentation in our criminal justice system. In the past 15 years, for example, we have an increase of over 75% of racialized people in our federal custodial prisons, in our federal penitentiaries, and a decrease of white Canadians of about 3%. So we know that there is a movement that requires longitudinal study. And when we have done that longitudinal study, we see that there is an overrepresentation of racialized Canadians in the enforcement of laws and in the sentencing for criminal matters.
Krista, let me ask you just a very neutral, open-ended question.
Okay.
How much justice do you get in the province? How much of it depends on how much money you have?
Oh, definitely. There's a tie between poverty or stable income between how much access to justice you have. I mean, the system, and this is part of why, legal aid is supposed to exist, is to assist those that can't afford legal representation. But clearly, there is a huge discrepancy between whether you can afford legal assistance or not. I mean, parts of justice are supposed to be accessible to individuals with or without counsel, but anyone who finds themselves in a courtroom will tell you the self-represented litigant is not going to fare as well as someone who is paying, $1,000, $2,000, $3,000 an hour for criminal representation. So there's a huge disparity between what people can afford and how they can access justice. We also have a whole host of other issues that tie to both poverty and racialization that impact how people will do in court processes.
I don't want to sound naive here, but are you telling me there are lawyers in Toronto who get $3,000 an hour for criminal cases?
Oh, I'm sure there's some that actually get more. Those of us in social justice, obviously, like our clinic is a nonprofit, so there are a number of lawyers who do the work without, obviously, those rates. But even when you come from a nonprofit, like an organization providing legal services is sometimes also at a deficit for resources to be able to take the caseload to assist individuals. So that actually also impacts the access to justice. So you can have fine, smart people doing good work and still sort of hitting the wall when it comes to resources or accessing justice for their clients.
Gotcha. Nana, I wonder if you could just sort of take us through the main points of this new Legal Aid Ontario report, which was released a little while ago, but of course then the pandemic hit and it kind of got very much lost in the shuffle of the coverage of the pandemic. It's called Racialized Communities Action Plan. What are the main objectives in that plan?
Yeah, it's a very lofty plan. It's a 10-year plan that sets out 17 initiatives that legal aid will embark on over the next 10 years. And the three high-level goals in the plan include access to justice, services for racialized communities, and then also tackling systemic racism, systemic discrimination in the justice system. So I think some examples of some of the initiatives include ensuring legal aid staff are reflective of the racialized low-income community in Ontario. Some include training for legal aid service providers. That includes duty counsel and criminal defense lawyers who receive certificates, ensuring that there's training on how to raise race-related arguments, which I think is really important. So there were a lot of great initiatives, lofty goals, and I'm hoping that legal aid is committed to putting these in place.
Well, Anna Maria, let me ask you, do you think, first of all, that the report has outlined the right things? In other words, have they shone the spotlight in the right places? And then following up on that, have they made effective solutions to the problems that they've identified?
I think they have. I think it's a very well thought out report, and it examines some very some solutions that are likely to result in an improvement in the situation, particularly because they do tackle sort of the root sources of the disparate outcomes that we see in our criminal justice system on the basis of racialization. Now, as with all lofty goals and lofty objectives, the success will no doubt depend on the commitment by the government and the commitment to funding those objectives, because resources and the resource deficit when it comes to these kinds of initiatives really is what dictates the ultimate success. We need to put our money where our mouth is when it comes to funding these kinds of initiatives. And if we're really serious about it, then we will dedicate funds to, or allocate funds to implement these objectives and these initiatives.
Sure. Krista, I don't have to tell you that, we've covered numerous stories here on the agenda. And oftentimes when our provincial institutions want to look into something, they think they are covering all the bases, and yet somehow the Indigenous population still gets short shrift. Was that the case here?
Well, not necessarily short shift, because legal aid does have an Aboriginal justice strategy. So I agree there are some good points of this, and it is lofty goals. I'm a little concerned that some of the lofty goals or aspirations may be too generalized in the report. So the
Like
legal
what?
aid board. The Legal Aid Board approved this process, or this strategic consultation, back in 2016, and it releases in 2020. So they had 4 years to work on a 40-page report. And essentially, one of the big issues we have is that representation. So, for example, if the goal is to have legal professionals representative of the population, their metrics aren't clear. So what is that based on? So, for example, I'll use the Indigenous example. 2.8% of Ontario's population is Indigenous. Does that mean having 2.8% of the legal professional or assistants is enough? Or do we have to look at something like the fact that half of First Nations live on reserve and 80% of them live in poverty? Or what about the actual certificates that legal aid is issuing? So, in 2015, we knew that legal aid's total certificates, 15% of those were being issued for Indigenous people. Is that the representative mark? Should we have 15% of people providing legal aid be Indigenous as well? So the marker is not very clear. So I think it's ambitious and a lofty goal, and I would love it if we could see an increase in Indigenous people within the profession and assisting, but I'm not sure if the target is an accurate one or a clear one and an attainable one.
It's interesting. I think we've always been under the impression that, you are entitled to the percentage of the population that you represent, but you've given us a new metric, a new way of thinking about what representation really means. Why don't you answer the question? Which metric should prevail in this case?
I think the metric that should prevail, if legal aid is knowingly issuing 15% of their certificates for Indigenous individuals, then I think that should be the more aspirational goal. I think if they know that the money that they're putting out through certificates is actually going to assist Indigenous, it means they have to have, and not necessarily just Indigenous, but they need to have legal representation that is aware, culturally competent, properly trained on those issues. I think that's true for all racialized groups, but particularly for Indigenous, because they have the lowest percentage, but the highest incarceration rates, the highest arrest rates. It's not news. The only other thing I think that's important when looking at this report is there's this concept that there's a very lofty outcome goal that racialized people will experience the same outcomes as non-racialized people. And I think that it's a very generic statement, and that in order to be successful, they're going to actually have to take steps that see more representation and put the steps into place. Because otherwise it's like saying, gee, I wish there was an Indigenous overrepresentation. That's the goal we're going to meet. And, 10 years later, they can't.
Now, Anna Maria, let me remind people again that this report came out before the pandemic hit. Now the pandemic has hit, and I wonder whether COVID-19 has actually exacerbated some of the problems that this report identified. What's your thought on that?
Well, one of the things that the report identifies quite clearly is that the reality that access to justice is highly income dependent in the province of Ontario, and poverty is racialized in Ontario. So we talk about 29% of Ontario's population being racialized, and yet the low income proportion of Ontario's population that is racialized is about 42%. So what we're seeing is that a higher percentage of racialized Ontarians fall within the low income bracket. And what COVID-19 has shown us is that courts now are looking for a number of ways to reduce the contact between people so that they are less likely to infect each other. So to implement sort of social distancing in a courtroom setting. And what that has done is it has resulted in a greater reliance on technological strategies and technology to promote access to justice. We're seeing more things like electronic submission of documents and electronic hearings hearings through video conference. And all of those things, all of those strategies are very dependent on privileged access to technology, a high-speed internet, and a functioning computer. And when you combine that reality with the reality that a larger percentage of racialized Ontarians may not have access to that because they are low income, then we see a potential for the exacerbation of denial of access to justice and access to courts and court systems. So there's a potential there that the strategies that have been implemented during the COVID time that are designed to increase access to justice may actually have the opposite effect when you take into consideration the factors that this report highlights as being vulnerabilities for racialized communities.
And Nana, can I just understand, is anything happening in the justice system in Ontario right now, in as much as, are there any courts at all that are sitting, or is everything happening virtually right now?
Yeah, it's my understanding that everything is happening virtually. For example, the landlord-tenant board, telephone eviction hearings on an urgent basis are occurring. The Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, for example, they've suspended the limitation periods, and they are doing case management over the phone, video. So I understand that everything is online or by telephone if possible. So that is the case. Everyone's trying to make sure that social distancing is maintained, physical distancing is maintained.
Okay. And let me do this follow-up with you. And, I put this question out there, appreciating the fact that we don't have an Asian Canadian represented among our guests today. But having said that, I don't think I'm going out on a limb to say that Asian Canadians, and in particular, the Chief Medical Officer of Health of the country, have been disproportionately targeted for racism since the pandemic hit. And I wonder, Nana, could I get your comment on how well you think we are doing pushing back at all of that racism?
Well, I don't think we're doing very well. To be honest, I don't think individual Canadians are doing very well, and I don't think the government does very well generally when it comes to racial hate. I think that's key. And the experiences of Asian Canadians, from what I understand, I'm not in that community, but from what I understand, it's very problematic. And this is just showing the real racism, the insidious racism that does exist in our country that we often try to conceal and point to south of the border as being the main culprits. And it's really, really unfortunate. I think there could be more to be done. I also think it's important not to take away from the very real pain that Asian Canadians are experiencing right now. But I think it is important that we see the same outrage, the same swift condemnation by our political leaders for all hate, all forms of racial hate, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, all forms of hate and discrimination need to be swiftly condemned by our political leaders. And that just doesn't happen.
Well, for the record, let me just say, I think I've watched every single one geez, I was about to say Justin Trudeau's daily briefings, and he has raised it numerous times. And not only that, he raises it in a very dramatic and forceful way. So I think it's important that we put that on the record. Look, we've
Yes.
just got a few minutes left here. And Krista, let's just get started. It's a bit of a cliche to put it this way, but what the heck? Wave that magic wand, and if you had a chance to sort of change one thing immediately overnight based on the report that we have now, what would you do?
Well, the report talks about tracking community engagements to ensure that LAO service providers are engaging in community organizations to increase that better access to justice. And so, for example, places like Aboriginal Legal Services, that's what we do every day for Indigenous people. So my hope would be that more funding would actually stream to Indigenous legal organizations. And I'm sure other racialized communities that are represented by similar ethno clinics would agree that the money going. And the big point for this is Indigenous community actually has solutions. They have solutions that would help their community better, but everything often goes through so much red tape and administration that they don't get to actually realize the goals and the best steps for their community. So the national inquiry, the commissioners made a finding that, Indigenous community is in the best place to help with the victimization and reduction of violence. And it's true even in legal services. Indigenous service providers are in a better position. So instead of going through all the red tape or multiple layers of decision making, putting some autonomy into the hands of those that could actually deliver the services would help legal aid achieve that goal that's in their report on racialized communities.
Anna Maria, something you'd implement tomorrow if you could?
Because I'm contrarian, I'm going to do two things. One is is going to be the allocation of funding. As I mentioned before, really none of this will come to fruition if we don't allocate funding and money to these programs and these initiatives. We really need to allocate funding to bring about, as Nana mentioned, race-based arguments and court challenges that will embed in our actual laws principles that can be used to recognize this kind of systemic racism that exists in the criminal justice system. And then the second thing is really to educate actors within the criminal justice system. That includes judges, to increase their cultural competence, to realize and to recognize that oftentimes the criminal justice system is used to cure social and economic problems and not just legal ones. And this is an inappropriate use of the criminal justice system. So increasing cultural competence about the root sources and the socioeconomic structures that come into play in the overrepresentation of racialized Canadians in the criminal justice system is so important to diminishing or reducing that number over time, and increasing and bringing in expertise into the criminal justice system that, again, focus on social and economic factors, not just legal ones. So the use of social workers and sociologists to study and to bring about an import into the criminal justice system an understanding of the way in which race and cultural treatment impacts a person's decision to commit a crime and to the outcomes in criminal justice, in criminal cases overall.
I have enough time left to thank the three of you for coming on to TVO tonight. Krista Big Canoe, Anna Maria Ananager, and Nana Yanful. And Anna Maria, am I allowed to congratulate you for something that happened in your life 3 weeks ago?
You are. Thank you.
You just had a baby, and here you are doing TV already.
I know,
Good
but you can see it in my eyes.
Let me tell you something. That will go away, Anna Maria. That will go away after about 20 years. So don't worry.
Oh, boy.
It's really good of all of you to join us on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you
for having us.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.